the president.
So we're going to begin, and today's topic is in preparation for Purim for Megillat Esther, and we're going to be exploring the question of why did Haman hate the Jews? And we're going to use this question as a framing for a more theoretical or deeper question, which is the ever-present specter or problem of demon of anti-Semitism. Because one of the fascinating things when you look at Megillat Esther is that when you read it closely, it looks like a surprisingly modern text. And what I mean by that, it is that you don't have to look very hard within the Megillah to identify the dynamics of anti-Semitism that we are so familiar with from Jewish history. And it really makes it a fascinating text. One of the things I love about the Megillah is its profound sense of relevancy. But the simple fact that it is a biblical text that takes place outside the land of Israel, in exile, in which God's name does not even appear, makes it in some ways, as I was sort of saying before, a distinctly modern text. Right? There's something about the Jewish experience of the Megillah that we can all relate to in a much deeper way than we can relate to the Jewish experience as it's described in most books of the Tanakh. And as I said, when we look at the Megillah, we're going to be able to identify dynamics, particularly around anti-Semitism, that we are all, very much familiar with. And what's particularly interesting with the Megillah is that the dynamic of anti-Semitism that is present is again something that's deeply modern. And what I mean by that is that for, let's say, the last 1,000 years of Jewish history, most anti-Semitism was Christian anti-Semitism, meaning it was Christians persecuting Jews because they were Jews. And what makes Christian anti-Semitism unique is that it has a deep theological component to it, meaning Christians, I don't want to say they hate Jews, but they thoroughly dislike Jews or found Jews repulsive or hated Jews for deeply theological reasons, right? And again, we're sort of familiar with these, right? The idea that the Jews were involved in the killing of Jesus, and probably even the more important idea, the fact that the Jews refused to accept the New Testament, right? The gospel, right? We are the stubborn nation who God turned his back on, yet we refuse to hear God's new gospel, refuse to listen to it, right? So it's that stubbornness of the Jews, along with whatever our sins were in the past with Jesus, that drives Christian anti-Semitism in very, very profound ways. But as I said, Christian anti-Semitism has a very much a theological basis to it. Modern anti-Semitism, much less so. And as we look into the Megillah, I think we kind of all know this, right? Clearly, the anti-Semitism that is present in the Megillah does not have a theological base to it, at least not on the surface level, right? It seems to be something much more human on a certain level, something, again, that we can relate to. So what we're going to do is we're going to look at some of the, we'll do some close readings of the Megillah, and then what I particularly want to do is explore this question, particularly why does Haman hate the Jews, through more of a psychoanalytic lens, because you'll see that psychoanalytic thought has something very interesting to say about this question of anti-Semitism, and it's really fascinating how the Megillah reveals a lot of dynamics that I would say psychoanalysis has really turned up as it relates to the world's oldest hatred, so to speak. So when you think of anti-Semitism in the Megillah, there's usually one part that really sticks out. And it's the third chapter, Perek Gimel. It's after Mordechai has refused to bow to Haman, and Haman's very angry. And Haman goes to King Ahasuerus, basically to try to convince him to kill the Jews. And the reason this section, I would say, is so famous, or it's the part that we are immediately drawn to, is that the argument that Haman uses to try to convince Ahasuerus to kill the Jews is, again, something that is, again, so resonant with our understanding of Jewish history. So this is, as I said, it's Perek Gimel, Pasuk Chet. Vayomer Haman lemelech Ahasuerus. Haman says to King Ahasuerus, Yeshno am echad mifuzar and mifurad bein ha'amim. says Achashverosh, there's this one nation that is spread out and separated through all the different countries of your empire. But if you think about it for a moment, the beginning of the Megillah makes clear there are 127 countries in the Persian Empire. It's a multicultural, multi-ethnic empire. It spans, as it says, Mehodu Viad Kush, right, from India to Ethiopia. Right, so there's many different countries, many different ethnicities, many different religions. But Haman is singling out one nation, one people, and this people is spread out through the whole empire, right? And part of the reason this is significant is that, again, most nations, most ethnicities are located in one particular place. And where's that one particular place that they're located? Well, in their homeland, right? So the very fact there's a nation that's spread out all over the place and not located, like, let's say, in their homeland, is something different. It's something that makes the Jews different and significant. And we'll see, because again, each one of these arguments sort of is going to tie to the next one. So the Jews are spread out, they're all over the place. And again, I would say the subtext here is they could be anywhere, right? You don't know where there might be a Jew hiding, right? That's the sort of the implication here. He continues, Haman, he says, B'chol medinot malchutecha, right, in all the countries of your empire, v'datehem shonot mikol am. They're dateim, and normally dat means religion, but here it means more religious practices and customs, right? Their religious practices and customs are different from every other nation. Now, again, what's sort of interesting here is you might think, well, every nation has a different set of religious practices than every other nation, right? What's the chiddush, right? What's so special about the Jews? But again, Haman seems to be implying that Jewish rituals and customs, right? There's something about the way Jews do things religiously that makes them different. And again, maybe he's hinting here to sort of like monotheism, right? There are elements of Jewish religion that are different from anywhere else. But again, it's a subtext, it's a hint, right? There's something about their religion, their practices that makes them different. And what I'll point out is when you look at the Megillah as a whole, there's no indication of anything that really seems to make the Jews different. Right? Jews are very assimilated in the book of Esther. Right? Esther and Mordechai have Persian names, not Jewish names, or Esther has a Jewish name, Hadassah, but she goes by her Persian name. Right? Megillah does not describe any religious practices of any kind, but Haman nonetheless is telling Achashverosh, right, those Jews, they're everywhere, you don't know where they are, and there's something different about them, right? Being a Jew means they do things differently, even though he doesn't even spell out what that means. And perhaps because he doesn't spell it out, it leaves it open to the imagination. Achashverosh can imagine, what are these crazy things the Jews are doing that make them different? And again, you hear the echoes here of all the anti-Semitic propaganda that we're familiar with. He continues, Haman, and now we get to the final, I guess, line here, right? The Jews don't follow the laws, the rules of the king, right? The Jews are subversive. And for the king, there's no benefit, there's nothing worthwhile to keep the Jews around. So just to summarize here again, just the arguments as they're laid out by Haman, right? There's this nation of Jews that could be anywhere and everywhere. They're all over the place. You don't know where they might be, where they might be hiding. There's something about them that makes them different in their Jewishness and their practices, even though you don't exactly know what it is. And then, of course, this leads to the final claim that the Jews are disloyal, that the Jews are subversive, right? They don't really listen to the king, right? They're not going to follow his laws, and it's not worth it for the king to keep them around. And again, I'm not the first person to point this out, how these arguments are, again, so common to the Jewish experience throughout history, and I would say particularly in the 19th and even 20th century, right? This idea of Jews being different and Jews potentially being disloyal citizens was at the heart of all the discussions in Europe around emancipation, right? When countries became free and we're going to have actual citizens, people are going to be free, the question that consistently came up is, could Jews be a citizen, right? Could a Jew be a citizen of France? Or was the Jew going to be loyal simply to other Jews, right? That was the question that came up, and that fear, that specter of disloyalty, again, was the ammunition for so much suspicion and hatred of the Jews, right? You have to think really no further than the Dreyfus affair in France, in which a Jewish soldier in the French army, a Jewish officer, was basically put on trial for being a spy, and everybody kind of knew it was a show trial. There was a kangaroo court. And again, it was all this kind of thing. Is this Jew really a Frenchman? Is he loyal? Is he not loyal? Right? And maybe it's not worth it to keep these Jews around. It's not worth the trouble. And then Haman goes on to basically try to convince the king to sweeten the pot, saying that, if you let me kill them, you'll be able to get all this money out of it. Right? So he's appealing to the king's own self-interest here, his own financial self-interest, as a way of persecuting the Jews, which is also interesting here, right? Once Haman lays out the suspicions that the Jews are just loyal, he doesn't leave it at that, right? He could have just said, well, that should be enough, right? The king would want to get rid of them. But he appeals to the king's, I would say, financial self-interest. And that's particularly interesting, I think, because, again, that's often the case. When leaders decide to persecute the Jews, meaning not just the people, not just a folk, anti-Semitism, but when it comes from the top, right, it's always very clear that there's a political and financial self-interest involved, right, that it's self-serving for whether it's the king or whoever, to be able to do such things. And then, of course, Achashverosh goes on, he takes the ring off, and he says, Haman, you have the full authority to do this. So, as I said, this section is what we're often drawn to when we think about the Megillah reflecting anti-Semitism, because these kinds of dynamics, as I said, recur again and again throughout Jewish history. So we could focus on this part and really sort of get into some of these sort of political questions. And again, the Jews being subversive, the Jews not being trusted, right? Anti-Semitism being a ploy to basically serve other political or personal interests. But the reason I don't really want to just focus on this or stop here is because if you just look at these verses, while it's deeply resonant with what we think about anti-Semitism, they also miss something. And what these verses miss is the fundamentally irrational nature of anti-Semitism. Right? There's something about the hatred that anti-Semites have for Jews that is something we can't even really wrap our minds around. It's so extreme. It's so crazy, for lack of a better expression. And what I think we have to do if we really want to understand anti-Semitism is sort of try to get at what is this craziness that sits behind it, right? And we see this with Haman. That Haman gets angry that Mordechai won't bow down, and then Haman's anger just sort of explodes out of control, and he wants to take it out on all of the Jews, right? And Haman goes to great lengths here, great political lengths, to try to get rid of the Jews. He takes great risks. If Haman didn't try to kill the Jews, Haman would still be around at the end of the Megillah, or there wouldn't even be a holiday. There wouldn't even been a fear of Jews being destroyed. So Haman's irrational hatred for the Jews ultimately ends in his own destruction, which is, I think, something we have to keep in mind. And again, it's that irrational nature of Haman's hatred, which is, I think, so important. And that's why, for me at least, this idea of how psychoanalysis can kind of maybe get at some of the deeper things going on here is very important. So to start to understand Haman's hatred of the Jews, we have to start, of course, with Haman's hatred for Mordechai. Which begins in the beginning of the third chapter. We're introduced to the character of Haman, and what we're told is as follows. This is already after Vashti's been deposed. They've come up with the idea of replacing Vashti through a beauty contest, and Esther is chosen, and Esther becomes the favored queen or consort of Achashverosh. And then we're introduced to Haman, and it says here, this is Parag Gimel. אחר הדברים האלה גידל המלך אחשוורוש את המן בן עמדת האגיגי וינשאהו וישם את כיסו מעל כל השרים אשר איתו. But we're told that after some period of time, King Achashverosh appoints Haman above all the other advisors. He literally places him on a throne or chair above all the other ministers, advisors that are with Achashverosh. So this is, we're introduced to Haman's rise to power, though we're not given a reason for why Haman is suddenly Achashverosh's favorite, why he's now so powerful himself. And then we're told in the next verse, V'chol avdei hamelech asher b'shar hamelech korim u'mishtachavim leHaman. Right, we're told that all the servants of the king that are in the gate of the king bow before Haman, because the king commanded it. Mordechai lo yichra v'lo yishtachaveh. But Mordechai does not bend over or bow before Haman. Now, what we're not told here is why is it that this rule has been made for everybody to bow down before Haman. It's a little strange, to be honest, right? Nowhere in the Megillah does it say anybody has to bow down before Ahasuerus. So the very idea that people have to bow down before Haman is really not so clear where exactly that's coming from. Obviously, the rabbis, the Midrash, goes to great lengths to try to understand what is Haman doing here, right? Even without getting into all of that, who is the kind of person that wants others to bow down before him, right? It's obviously somebody who is deeply obsessed with their own sense of power, right? And the act of bowing before somebody is a way of basically saying to the other person that, right, like, I am powerless before you, right? It's an act of total self-abasement. It's like the act of bowing down is a way of saying I am nothing before your power, your might. And what's important to keep in mind here, this is not like a little like bow like we do in Shemon Esrei or something like that, which we could sort of understand, right? There are other cultures which use smaller amounts of bowing as a way of showing respect. Here, it definitely seems to imply it's a full prostration on the ground, right? And Jews only do that one time a year or 2 times a year, Rosh Hashanah, Yom Kippur. And when you do that in shul, you know, right? The act of fully bowing down is basically like making yourself nothing, right? We do it on Rosh Hashanah, Yom Kippur as if we're before God, but here you have Haman doing it and demanding it of everybody who is in Shar HaMelech. So again, it gives us a sense about who this person is, right? That Haman is somebody who is obsessed with power, and that part of his obsession with power means other people have to demonstrate how fundamentally small they are before him. And again, we know people like this, right? Obviously, in today's world, powerful people can't demand that you bow down before them, but I've certainly interacted with powerful people in different circumstances where they make it clear that they feel that they are more powerful than you, and they want to make sure that you realize that, right? If you've ever been in an office of a CEO and, right, like their whole desk and chair is set up to kind of be like towering over you, or if you've ever met somebody that when they go to shake your hand, they always do it in a way that like tries to crush your hand, right? These are things people do, usually men, and I'll point out the Megillah is very clear. Persia is a patriarchal society, right? It's the men in Persia who are obsessed with power. So again, without getting into all what that might mean, right, that there's something about masculinity in the Megillah that is associated with this obsession of power. And it's a power that ultimately isn't real, right? There's nothing there. But we see that here with Haman. And of course, as we're told, Mordechai doesn't bow down, but we're not told why is it that Mordechai doesn't bow down before Haman. It's striking because it says that the king has commanded everybody to bow before Haman. And at the end of the last parak, we know Mordechai is loyal to the king, because when Mordechai discovered an assassination plot against the king, Mordechai reported it to Esther, and Esther reported it to Ahasuerus. So Mordechai isn't necessarily in the habit of defying the king or the king's law, but here he seems to be doing so. And then we're told in the next verse, "Vayomru avdei hamelech asher b'shar hamelech leMordechai, madua ta'aveh mitzvat hamelech." Right, the other people that are at the gate, who consistently see that Mordechai doesn't bow down, they ask him, "Why are you not bowing down? Why are you not following the mitzvat hamelech, the commandments of the king?" And again, what's interesting here is Haman doesn't seem to see this. Right, it's not like they're all bowing down and like Mordechai is standing there defiant. Right, clearly they're bowing down, and Haman doesn't even see Mordechai isn't bowing down. But everybody else does, and they ask Mordechai, well, what's going on here? Why are you doing this? And the next verse says, "V'hikam rami lav yom v'yom v'lo shema alehem." Now, we're not initially told why is it. Mordechai doesn't answer them. He doesn't say why he's not bowing down. What that does say is that every day the other people at the gate keep asking, "Why are you not bowing down? Why are you not bowing down?" And again, it's not clear if they're doing this out of concern, right? Like if he doesn't bow down, right, something bad's going to happen, maybe to all of them. Or maybe we don't know, or maybe they're angry at him, or maybe they're just curious. Vayagidu lahamam nirot hayamdu divrei Mordechai ki yigid lahem asher Yehudi. So they do eventually tell Haman as they're trying to determine what exactly it is that Mordechai is doing here. And what we're told, or at least what Mordechai conveys to them, that they convey to Haman, is that the reason that he is not bowing down is because he's a Jew, right? That's the answer. Why does Mordechai not bow down before Haman? Yehudi, ani Yehudi, right? I am a Jew. Now, again, we're not clear why this is the case, meaning elsewhere in Tanakh, we see individuals who bow down before other individuals. I mean, Jews who bow down before other individuals. Yaakov, when he has his reunion with Esav and he's fearful for his life, right? Yaakov does a full prostration before Esav. So it's a little hard to understand why is it that here Mordechai is not doing this prostration before Haman, but his answer is because I'm a Jew. Now you could say maybe this starts to speak to this idea that Jews are disloyal, but again, without knowing more of what's going on here, we're still left, wondering, what's really at stake here. Vayar Haman ki ein Mordechai korea mishtachaven lo. Haman now sees, right? Before he didn't see it, he heard about it, but now he sees that Mordechai doesn't bow down before him. And we're told, Vayimale Haman chema, right? And that Haman was filled with chema, which means anger. But what you have to understand is that chema doesn't just mean anger, right? If you're familiar with modern Hebrew, what does cham mean, right? Cham means hot or warm. And the proper translation of this would be that Haman was incensed, right? He was filled with anger to the point in which it was like his whole body was inflamed, right? This wasn't just like a little bit angry. This was somebody that was so angry that he was like totally out of control. That's what Haman means, right? His whole body was like inflamed with anger. And that at least helps us understand why is it that Haman jumps from simply looking at Mordechai as somebody he doesn't like and maybe wants to kill, to suddenly this irrational, inflamed anger causing him to feel, you know what? Killing Mordechai isn't enough. I need to kill all the Jews. And that's what it says in the next verse. It's not enough for Haman just to kill Mordechai because he's so angry. It's Mordechai, because he finds out who's Mordechai's nation, who's his people. And Haman now really wants to destroy all the Jews. Jews, wherever they are in Mordechai, in Achashverosh's kingdom. And this, I think, is again, what's so interesting is that there's this irrational leap from a hatred of Mordechai to a hatred of all Jews. And we see what's behind this hatred is this profound anger. Now, again, we have to ask ourselves, why is it that this upsets Haman so much? And I think, again, the simple answer here is that if Haman is an individual who is obsessed with his own power, right? If he's a narcissist, for lack of a better word, right? Then what a narcissist cannot stand is anybody who makes him feel small, right? And Mordechai defying Haman makes Haman feel small. And what Haman wants more than anything in the world is to feel big and powerful, right? That's why he's presumably demanding with the king's enforcement that everybody bow down before him. And the fact that Mordechai won't do that, Haman cannot let that go, right? Because it's like the simple act of not bowing down before Haman like tears at Haman's very soul. And again, we're going to unpack a little bit more what this means, this anger, this irrational anger that Haman feels for Mordechai, and ultimately for all the Jews as well. And then, of course, the narrative here is that he goes on and he basically throws lots to determine when is the day he wants to kill the Jews, and then goes to Ahasuerus and makes his pitch like we just saw before. But again, I want to continue to dive a little bit deeper and look a little bit more closely at why Haman is so angry at Mordechai and ultimately all the other Jews as well. And again, it's the irrational nature of the anger that is in some ways the dimension of anti-Semitism that we're most familiar with, and even its most self-destructive aspect. But we're gonna look later on at some of the Nazi anti-Semitism, just because the connections between the Megillah and Nazism and Hitler in particular are so suggestive. But again, like as we know, if you read any kind of Nazi propaganda, or you've ever taken a look at Mein Kampf or read any of Hitler's speeches, right? What you see there is this profound, I would say bordering on, or not even bordering, irrational anger directed at the Jewish people for what is perceived to be for them being perceived as the source of all of Germany's problems. Right? If I'll foreshadow a bit, right? The very existence of the Jews makes Hitler feel small, right? And therefore, again, it makes Germany feel small, right? And therefore, the only way for Hitler to feel big and for Germany to feel big and powerful is for the Jews to be eliminated. But of course, the distinction I'll point out is that unlike here, maybe, where Mordechai defies Haman, right? The Jews in Germany and Jews in the history of modernity, right? Jews as emancipated citizens of the West, right? Were loyal citizens. They weren't disloyal, but nonetheless, there was this irrational anger and even jealousy that their very existence of the Jewish people made, like I said, Germany, Hitler, or any anti-Semite feel small. So the next part of the Megillah that we have to look at to sort of get at Haman's psychology here, and again, why is it that he hates Mordechai so much, and why ultimately he hates the Jews so much? And that is in Perek Hey, the 5th chapter of the Megillah. It takes place after Esther has been convinced by Mordechai to go to Ahasuerus and to try to save the Jewish people. And when she goes to Ahasuerus, her first request is, as you remember, is not initially, oh, please, king, save all my people, right? She invites Ahasuerus and Haman to a Suda, to a party. And when Haman hears this, he's, of course, very, very excited, right? Like, this is a guy who's obsessed with power, right? This is a guy who wants to feel big and powerful, right? There's two things that he can do to feel big and powerful. He can, again, make people bow down to him, like to feel big and powerful as a representative of the king within the, within the kingdom, within the empire. That's one option. The other option is to be as close to the king as possible, right? To be like, identifying fully with the king. And again, to be invited to a private meal with the king and his wife, right? What better experience could there be of being closer to power, and particularly the power of the king, which in Persia, as we know, right, to be the king is essentially to have absolute power, right? The king's word is law, right? The king can kind of do whatever he wants, right? So it makes sense that Haman, that's what Haman would also be obsessed with, right? That he wants to be as close to that as possible. He wants to have as much of that as possible. So when he hears he's invited to the Suda, and again, it's not just that he's close to the king, he's close to the king in the private sphere. And I think that's also important, right? It's one thing to be close to the king in his court, right? It's like one thing to be close to your boss at work, but it's another thing to be close to your boss in your private life, right? That's a sense of closeness that somehow feels that you're maybe much closer to power than the experience of being close to them at work. So when Haman hears about the invitation to the Suda, he's very happy. And he leaves the palace to go home. Again, all excited. And of course, who does he see when he leaves the palace? Because when you leave the palace, you have to go through Shar HaMelech, you have to go through the king's gate, and he sees Mordechai. Now, I want to read these verses carefully because, again, I think they're very powerful and important. This is Perek Hey, verse Tet. Vayetze Haman b'yamahu sameach v'tov lev. Right, Haman leaves the palace on that day. He's feeling happy and he's feeling very, very good. Right, this is a guy who's feeling like elated. V'chirot Haman et Mordechai, and then he sees Mordechai b'shar HaMelech at the king's gate. V'lo kam v'lo zam mimenu, and of course Mordechai doesn't get up before Haman. Right, so you can imagine it's just sort of the contrast here. Right, like Haman is feeling so great. Oh, what could be better than this private invitation to be with the king and the queen? And as he's on cloud 9, he sees Mordechai. Mordechai doesn't bow down. And you can just imagine how at that moment, how angry and upset Haman must be. And we're told once again, V'yimaleh Hamano Mordechai chema, right, that Haman feels anger, this burning, incensed anger at Mordechai. And one can even maybe suggest that this kind of anger that Haman feels, he maybe only felt it that very first time he saw Mordechai not bow down before him. Meaning, maybe he was sort of used to it in between, but there's something about this moment that is just as bad as the very first time when Mordechai wouldn't bow down before Haman. And we're told, Vayitapak Haman vayavo beito vayishlach vayaveh hava v'et zeresh ishto. And so Haman goes home, and he's now not feeling very happy. And his family is there, and they kind of gather up and greet him. And then Haman, of course, is going to tell them about what's happening. We're told by Yisaper lehem Haman et kvod oshro v'rov banav et kol asher gidlo hamelech v'et asher niso. So what does Haman tell his family? he tells him the story of how great things are going for him. How not only is he the second in charge to the king, but he's so close to the king that the king has invited him to a private meal with the queen. So again, this is the moment, where you would think Haman would be the happiest, right? He gets to boast about all of his great achievements to his family, and they're listening with bated breath. And like, this is it, right? You feel the best when you get to, like, again, when you're a narcissist, when you get to boast about how great you are to other people, and they're transfixed by it. And again, so you can imagine this is supposed to be a moment where Haman feels great. However, he keeps going here, and he goes on to to describe how he's been invited to the king and queen's banquet, and they've only invited me, right? Nobody else is invited. It's just me and them. But then he says in verse Yud Gimel, "V'chol zeh einenu shaveli. B'chol eit asher ani ro'eh et Mordechai Yehudi yoshev b'shar hamelech." He says, all these amazing things I've achieved, they are not worth anything to me every time I see Mordechai, the Jew, sitting at the gate of the king. Meaning, all these good things that he should have, all this amazing power and enjoyment that he should have in his life, the moment he sees Mordechai, it's like it all disappears. It's like it all evaporates. Right? And then Zeresh comes up with this idea, well, just kill Mordechai. What are you waiting for? Don't wait until the decree when all the Jews will be killed. Let's hang him now and just get it out of the way. And of course, Haman likes that idea. Right? Haman likes that idea because it's just like, I don't want to wait. I want to get rid of Mordechai now. Now, again, the key verse here that I think gets at the whole psychological dynamic of what's going on with Haman's hatred of Mordechai and ultimately his anti-Semitism as well is this verse Yud Gimel, right? That no matter how good Haman should feel, seeing Mordechai, it's like all that goodness just disappears in a moment. And particularly this is where he says, "V'chol zeh einenu shaveli." Now, shaveh can mean like worth it. Like all of these good things, it's like it's not worth it to me. But what's fascinating is one of the medieval commentaries by the Rid says that when Haman says none of these good things are worth it to me, that what he really means is I can't enjoy any of the good things. And you're going to understand, and we'll get into it in just a minute, why enjoyment is perhaps the key idea here, right? That Haman cannot enjoy any of his achievements as long as Mordechai is around. Mordechai's mere presence prevents Haman from enjoying fully. It's like you might even say Haman's enjoyment is being stolen by Mordechai's mere presence. And therefore, he has to get rid of Mordechai and all the Jews if Haman is going to be able to enjoy all of his power, right? And all of these incredible, joyous, amazing, wonderful things that he has been able to achieve for himself. Now, this idea of enjoyment that Haman cannot enjoy until he gets rid of Mordechai is very, very significant. Because enjoyment is something that we don't always think about as a core idea. But in psychoanalysis, enjoyment takes on a very, very special kind of meaning. Now, if you think back to Freud, if you're familiar with Freud at all, right, he doesn't use the word enjoyment, but he uses the word libido, right? And Jacques Lacan, who was probably one of the more significant followers of Freud, a French psychoanalyst, he develops the idea of jouissance. Jouissance is a form of enjoyment, libido and jouissance. And what makes this idea of enjoyment a little different than the way we normally think about it is that it's not just, oh, this is a good thing, therefore I want to do it. Enjoyment always has like something more to it, right? When Freud uses the term libido, it almost has like a sexual characteristic to it, or there's an investment of let's put it this way, that enjoyment is something in which we have a deep emotional investment in, or we have part of our identity is invested in it, right? So the things that we truly enjoy are the things that make life worth living, right? And we don't want to give those things up, right? That's how important they are to us. And if you can't enjoy life, right, if you don't have those things that are most precious to you in life and you're able to enjoy them, then it sort of feels like, well, life's not even worth it, right? So enjoyment is actually something that's really, really serious because, when you're depressed, it kind of means that this is what people, maybe the most basic characteristic of depression is people who are depressed say, right? Like I just can't enjoy anything, right? So there's something about enjoyment that is deeply, deeply fundamental to who we are as human beings. And one of the things, particularly those who study the writings of Jacques Lacan, point out is that we want to believe that our lives, that we can achieve this state of total enjoyment. However, in truth, we're only human. And because we can't ever achieve this sort of imagined, fantasized total enjoyment, right? There's always something that's getting in the way. Therefore, we need to be able to point at something, or usually someone, who is preventing us from achieving our full sense of enjoyment in life. So I want to look at briefly two psychoanalytic thinkers who developed this idea, Todd McGowan and Mladen Dolar. And what they get at in different but very interesting ways is this sense of how there are always somebody out there that is getting in the way of our enjoyment. And as Tom McGowan's going to point out, this is very much the way that racism works, right? And I'll walk through how this makes sense. But as we read these two thinkers, what you're going to find is that it seems almost in like shocking detail how closely the sort of phenomenon that they're describing gets at the underlying theme of the Megillah, of Haman's hatred for Mordechai, and ultimately modern notions of anti-Semitism as well. So here's what Todd McGowan writes. And again, he's dealing with the problem here that we have this fantasy of total enjoyment, meaning so much of our lives are structured by fantasies, right? We work and we try to make money because we have this fantasy that someday we're going to have all the money that we could ever need and we're going to be able to enjoy it, right? Like that's a basic fantasy most of us have. We want to work and then we want to enjoy retirement when we have all this money, when we're finally wealthy, when we can stop working. But of course, the way that our fantasies often work is that there's always sort of something that seems to keep getting in the way from us being able to fulfill our fantasy. And from a psychoanalytic perspective, that's important. Like we actually create fantasies so that we can't fulfill them because it's the fantasy that actually keeps us, going forward in life. So here's what McGowan says. He says, the fundamental task of fantasy is to transform an impossible satisfaction that no one could attain into a prohibited satisfaction that becomes unattainable due to the fantasized obstacle that prevents the subject from having its object. Meaning, we create these fantasies for ourselves in which there's like a pot of gold at the end of the rainbow, but then there's always some obstacle that prevents us from getting to the pot of gold. And we all do this, and we do this on purpose because we're never going to be able to have this experience of total enjoyment. So therefore, we need an obstacle that keeps getting in the way. He says there's no such thing as complete satisfaction, no matter what we all tell ourselves. We all tell ourselves that there is. But complete satisfaction comes to appear possible through the erection of an obstacle to it, meaning it's only through, right, the monster that blocks my access to the pot of gold that I can then believe that there is a pot of gold, right? Like if there's an obstacle, then it must mean if I can get rid of the obstacle, there's actually something really good, that my fantasy object can be there. He says this operation enables subjects to believe that if they eliminate the obstacle, they can attain the impossible and overcome their status as lacking subjects. And one of the most basic insights of Freudian psychoanalysis in general is that we're all lacking, right? We all have these fantasies of wholeness, of plenitude, of everything being great, but like we're human, we're finite, we're limited, and everything we do is always going to be not quite right. That's just what it means to be human. But we have a very hard time living that way. We want to believe that there are people out there who have these wonderful, idealistic, amazing lives, right? And that we can have it too. Like what we don't want to think is even the people that we idolize the most are like lacking as much as we are, right? Like that they have all the same stupid problems about what it means to be a human that we do. And even the richest person in the world, even Bill Gates, does not live this 24/7 fantasy of total enjoyment, right? If anything, he deals with a lot of the same stupid problems a lot of us do. McGowan continues, he says, fantasy allows one to imagine an enjoyment without lack, but it does so only by creating an obstacle who bears responsibility for the failure to attain this enjoyment. Now, what's fascinating when you read this is like you literally cannot help but see those verses we just read about Haman, right? Like Haman is the second most powerful person in Persia, right? Like who could have it better than Haman except for, Ahasuerus? And yet Haman cannot enjoy fully. right? And the reason he cannot enjoy fully, first off, as I said, nobody can enjoy fully, but therefore he imagines this obstacle of Mordechai, right? That as long as Mordechai is around, Haman, can't be as happy and enjoy as much as he really wants to, right? Because as long as Mordechai around, there's one person who's not bowing down to him. But if you could get rid of Mordechai, then you can imagine like how amazing Haman would feel, right? Then he's finally going to have all the enjoyment that he's dreamed about. His fantasy will finally be fulfilled. Now, McGowan goes on to give a very interesting example here. Again, this is the way racism works, is what he argues, is that racism always creates a fantasy about a racial other whose existence gets in the way of your race being able to achieve its full enjoyment. And he uses the example here of racism against Black people, typically, again, the American version of it, right? And the way that the racist fantasy works in America, right, is that, I'll read it. We'll read his explanation and we'll walk through it. He says, in the American version of the racist fantasy, the racial other is often a Black man who enjoys white women at the expense of white men. Meaning, the part of the way the racist fantasy works is that the white man imagines that the Black man is able to have enjoyment that the white man can't have. So what is this enjoyment that the Black man has, right? That the Black man is able to be sexually adept with white women in a way that the white man is not, right? He says the Black man's superior sexual prowess renders him more able, this is the racist fantasy, obviously, this is not the reality, to please white women. And this is actually like a very common trope amongst like, white nationalist propaganda, is that like the Black man is overly sexual and seduces the white woman. And I, as a white man, can't have the enjoyment that he has because he's able to have all this excessive enjoyment that I cannot. And he goes on, he says, against such a challenger, the white man has no chance to measure up, right? In this sense, the racist fantasy does not clearly and simply establish the white man's superiority in all domains. Right? Part of the fascinating thing about the racist fantasy is that the racial other that you hate is always both inferior and superior, right? They're inferior, right? Because you're better than them. Your race is better than them, right? But on the other hand, they're an obstacle. They're dangerous because they are somehow better than you in some way. Right? In this case, the Black man may be inferior to white men in everything, except in this one area, in his sexual prowess, and that's what makes him dangerous. And again, we see this in the exact parallel in Nazi Germany, right? Jews were less than human, Jews were disgusting, Jews were weak, Jews were stupid, and then at the same time, right, Jews were had taken over all the industries, and Jews were the leading capitalists, right? That somehow the racial other is always inferior, but also seemingly superior and therefore dangerous. He continues, he says, the racist fantasy attributes absolute enjoyment to the racial other in order to give the subject an obstacle that makes its own full satisfaction seem hindered rather than impossible. Because you have the racist fantasy, then you can tell yourself, well, if I got rid of the Black man, then I could be with the white women. Then all the white men could be with the white women exactly as they're supposed to. The white man's failures with women thus becomes the fault of the Black man, not the white man. The racial other is the bar preventing the subject from enjoying the way it imagines it might, which again is the whole point here with Haman. Now, what's interesting here is that enjoyment is often, has a sexual connotation to it, right? I was trying to think the classic examples of enjoyment from like a psychoanalytic perspective is sort of like money, power, and sex, right? Like those are the three things, and Freud might say it's all sex, but regardless, those are the three things that are often at the heart of enjoyment. In the Megillah, sex is not really front and center, but money and power is. And as long as Mordechai seems to have a certain power that Haman doesn't, and it threatens Haman, and Haman just keeps telling himself, oh, if I get rid of Mordechai, I'll finally be able to enjoy it. That's literally what he says to his wife. All these amazing things, I'll finally be able to enjoy them, but as long as Mordechai is around, I can't enjoy them. Now, another dimension of this, which is also, I think, really fascinating, and this is a point made by Melinda Dolar, is that this idea of the other who is somehow stealing my enjoyment or preventing my full enjoyment often comes through the frame of the double. And what do I mean by that? Is that it's a literary trope of certain stories in which the main character experiences another character who is like their double. It's like identical to them in some way. And this is a trope that appears in many different places. But when the double appears, and there's a famous story of Dostoevsky like this, I'm I probably should have thought of a good movie example. But when the double appears, that person that one who's just like you, right? That other seems to again get in the way of your enjoyment, right? Here's what he says: the double is a disturber of love. He typically springs up at the moment when one is about to touch or to kiss the girl of one's dreams. Right? Just at the moment where you're about to enjoy, right? Then the double, that like identical twin of yours, like pops up and gets in the way. He springs up when the subject comes close to the realization of his wishes of having the fantasy fulfilled. When he is on the brink of attaining full enjoyment, the completion of the sexual relation, the double appears to be the one who spoils and obstructs. Now, part of the reason this is interesting is that when we think about racism, we don't typically assume that the racial other is like you, right? The whole idea is that they're different from you. But what Dolar is pointing out is that sometimes, right, this other who's out there stopping you from being able to enjoy, sometimes they're most like that because they are most similar to you, right? And probably the best parallel to this idea of the double that he's describing here is the idea of sibling rivalry, right? And again, I have a brother and sister. I have, I have three boys and a girl myself. I fought with my siblings. I watch my siblings fight all the time, right? Sibling rivalry very much mimics the phenomenon that we're describing here. Because when brothers or siblings don't get along, right, there's rarely even a good reason for it, right? Usually it's simply the siblings' mere existence that feels like they're getting in the way of you being able to enjoy. Like, I know that. Like, when I was growing up at home, I know both of my parents are on, right? It could just be my brother or sister being home that was enough to be like, I can't be happy. Like, I can't really enjoy. When are they going to leave the house so I can be by myself and enjoy fully, right? That's the way siblings work. Like, their mere existence is enough to like get under your skin and make you feel like you can't really enjoy in the way that you want. So I said, on the one hand, racism is about a racial other who we posit is preventing us from having our full enjoyment. If we could get rid of them, we would be able to fully enjoy. But there's also this idea that it's the one who is like me, like a sibling, who gets in the way from me being able to enjoy. Now, again, in the Megillah, I would say both phenomena are very much in play here, right? The Jew is the racial other, right? Haman makes that very clear. They're different. There's something different about them, even if he doesn't really explain what it is. They're subversive, right? If Haman cares about power, then the fact that the Jews may not listen to the king, that's the thing that's most important to him, because Haman is all about power, and the Jews are showing in a certain level they're more powerful. Haman only wants to listen to the king. He wants to be as close to the king he can. But the Jews are the ones who might actually be, disloyal. That's what seemingly makes them so powerful in his eyes. If I had to psychoanalyze Haman, right? Mordechai will not bow down before Haman. It sure looks like, as much as Haman manipulates Achashverosh, that Haman fetishizes Achashverosh's power. Right? Haman can never imagine not bowing down before Achashverosh if Achashverosh demanded it, right? Because Haman is so obsessed with power. That means he sees it as the most important thing in the world. And he sees it that way in part because I presume he sees Achashverosh embodying it. So I want to get at this idea a bit more, that Mordechai and Haman are doubles of each other, right? That Haman sees Mordechai and sees something of himself in Mordechai. Now, this may sound kind of like a silly idea, but the Megillah actually makes this point in the most explicit way imaginable. It's rather striking, I have to tell you, how explicit the Megillah is about Mordechai and Haman, or Haman seeing himself in Mordechai, and that being very problematic. If you return to the next chapter, Perek Vav of the Megillah, so the last parak we just finished, Haman saying, as long as Mordechai's around, I can't enjoy. We got to get rid of him. In the next parak, we're told how Achashverosh can't sleep. And when Achashverosh is up at night because he can't sleep, what do? Right? They bring before him the Chronicles to read to him. And they read about how Mordechai saved Achashverosh's life. And Achashverosh asks, was Mordechai rewarded for this? And of course, he wasn't. So Achashverosh decides that he needs to reward Mordechai. And what does he do? How does he try to figure out what is the reward that Mordechai should have? Well, we see here in verse Dalet, right? Achashverosh doesn't want to come up with the reward himself, right? Because Achashverosh doesn't decide anything in the Megillah by himself, right? It's always other people deciding for him, right? It's one of the main narrative points. So when he realizes that Haman is just outside, right, he basically calls him in, What does Achashverosh do then? This is in verse Vav. Vayavo Haman, vayomer lo hamelech, ma la'aso b'ish asher melech hafetz bikaro. Right? He goes and he asks Haman, what should the king do for somebody that he wants to honor? Vayomer Haman b'libo, lemi yachmotz hamelech la'asot yakar yoter mimeni. Right? Haman immediately says to himself, who is it possible that the king would want to honor more than me? So basically, when Achashverosh turns to Haman and says, what should I do for somebody that I want to honor? He thinks that Achashverosh is talking about himself, that he's talking about Haman. So what Haman goes on to describe here is presumably all the things that he wants for himself, right? Haman goes on to describe his fantasy, right? Like it's like finding a magic lamp and rubbing it. A genie comes out and asks you for 3 wishes, right? That's essentially the position that Haman is in here, right? He has the chance to lay out his fantasy fully before the king, who's going to fulfill it for him. Like, what could be a more amazing experience than that? So, what does he do? He says, or what does he suggest? He says, "Yaviu levush malchut asher levash bo hamelech." Take out the king's garments, v'sus asher rachav alav hamelech, and the king's horse, v'asher nitan keter malchut berosho, and the king's crown. And what does Haman want to do with all of these things? Whoever it is that the king wants to reward should wear the king's crown, the king's clothes, and ride on the king's horse. It continues, "V'natona levush v'asus ish misarei hamelech hapartamim yilbishu et ha'ish asher hamelech hafetz bikaro yerkivu al asus." Right, you give him the king's clothes, you dress him up. He gets on the king's horse through the streets of the city. And you shall proclaim before him, this is what is done for the man who the king wants to honor. Now, again, so this is Haman's fantasy. Let's be Freudians for a moment, sort of pick apart his fantasy, right? What is Haman's fantasy ultimately? It's kind of clear, right? If you want to dress up like the king and wear the king's crown and ride the king's horse, you want to be the king, right? You want to be the embodiment of absolute power in Persia, and you want that paraded before everybody, right? Like, this is so that, again, it's fascinating too, right? Haman's enjoyment is dependent on other people seeing and validating what he has, right? We saw this before, right? He doesn't really enjoy anything that's not public, right? That's why he gets so obsessed when Mordechai doesn't bow down, right? It's people bowing down in public to him that make him happy, right? It's being able to go out in public dressed up as the king that is going to make him happy. But then, of course, we're told, "Vayomer hamelech laHaman, meher kachat levush v'tasus, kasher dibarta v'asechem leMordechai Yehudi." Achashverosh says to Haman, take the king's clothes, the king's horse, the king's crown, and do this all for Mordechai. Hayoshev b'shar hamelech, al tapel davar mikol asher dibarta. Don't miss any detail. Do exactly like you said, but do it for Mordechai. V'yikach Haman levush v'tasus v'yalbesh et Mordechai v'yarkiveu b'rachel v'ir. Haman has to take the king's garments and dress Mordechai, right? Again, he's the one who has to dress Mordechai, which again is an act of self-abasement, right? It's like he's serving Mordechai. Mordechai is the one with the power. Mordechai's, the king in this context. And then he's got to, march before Mordechai throughout the city and proclaim to everyone, this is what the king does for the one that he wants to honor, right? So if you remember before, I read Malajan Dolar's comments about the double, right? That the double pops up exactly at the moment when you think you're going to get your full enjoyment, right? This is the moment Haman thinks he's going to get his fantasy fulfilled. And that's exactly the moment when Mordechai appears and gets all of the enjoyment that Haman had wanted for himself. And what's fascinating here too, I'll point out, this is Haman's fantasy. Do we think this is Mordechai's fantasy? Personally, I don't think so. Mordechai's fantasy is saving the Jews, right? Mordechai's fantasy is not to be paraded in front of everybody. But again, we all have our fantasies, and this is what Haman wanted for himself, and instead it goes to Mordechai. Not only does it go to Mordechai, Haman has to walk through all the city having it rubbed in his face the whole time, right? So you see it here clearly. And again, the implication is, once again, Mordechai wasn't in the picture. Haman would get his fantasy fulfilled, right? He would be be paraded around in public as if he himself is the king. So before we wrap up, I want to just dive in a little bit deeper in some of these connections to anti-Semitism, because again, it should be relatively obvious right now. that anti-Semitism is when other people, other nations, other groups look at the Jews and say, wait a second, there's something about the Jews that as long as they're here, prevent me from being able to enjoy fully. Right? There's something about the Jews in which they're like stealing our happiness. And if we could just get rid of the Jews, everything would be right. Now, what's particularly interesting to me is that, as I said before, the Jews in the Megillah are not really different from the Persians. Right? They're actually very Persian. Right? So if we had to ask ourselves, are Jews the racial other, like African Americans have historically been in America? Not so much, because they're not so much marked publicly by their difference. Right? Jews in the Megillah are closer to this idea of the double. Right? They're like basically Persian, but there's something about them that's a little weird or different, and that's enough. Right? Like siblings. Right? They're really like me. Like my brother is, genetically closest to me as anybody on the planet, but there's something about him that's just different, and therefore his existence can get in the way of me being able to enjoy fully. And that's what makes anti-Semitism, any of this kind of racial hatred, so difficult, because it's so irrational, right? It's not based in any kind of reality, but it's so real and it's so intense because it's based in our fantasies. And if there's one thing psychoanalysis teaches us, is that our fantasies matter a heck of a lot more than reality. So some of these issues were already picked up very much by Sigmund Freud in one of his last works, Moses and Monotheism, which he writes in the 1930s. In no small part is a response to Nazism. Right? Freud is basically driven out of Germany by Nazis. It has to flee to London. And he writes Moses and Monotheism in part as a way of trying to grapple with what is anti-Semitism. Why do the Germans, right? He grew up in Vienna, right? He was, somebody who identified fully with, German culture, German language. Why is it that they turned on the Jews and hated them with this profound, irrational hatred? So he offers an explanation of sorts. Though he doesn't develop fully some of the ideas we've seen, they're here at least in an embryo. So, and again, what Freud wants to deal with, or what's most troubling to him, is just the intensity of anti-Semitism, right? And again, what we know is the more intense an emotion or reaction that we have to something, that tells us there's something really important there, or something that really challenges us there. So here's what he says. He says, there must, of course, be more than one reason for a phenomenon of such intensity and lasting strength as the popular hatred of the Jews. Meaning, you can come up with many reasons why people hate the Jews. It's not that hard to come up with reasons. And he's going to go through a whole bunch of them. But none of them on their own really explain this. He says a whole series of reasons can be divined, some of them which need no interpretation arise from obvious considerations, others lie deeper and spring from secret sources, which one would regard as the specific motives, meaning that some of these are more unconscious. In the first group, the most fallacious is the reproach of their being foreigners. Meaning the first reason why people come up with why Jews are hated, because they're foreigners, right? They're not from here. Since in many places nowadays, but Freud doesn't like the idea of seeing Jews as foreigners, since that would be the cause for anti-Semitism, since in many places nowadays, under the sway of anti-Semitism, the Jews were the oldest constituents of the population, or arrived even before the present inhabitants. Meaning, how could you say the Jews are foreigners when in a lot of places Jews have been there longer than most people? Says this is so, for example, in the town of Cologne, where Jews came with the Romans before it was colonized by Germanic tribes. Like if Nazis want to say Jews are foreigners and that's why they should be hated, but it doesn't make sense because there are Jews who have been in Germany before Germans have been there. So it can't be that they're foreigners. Other grounds for anti-Semitism are stronger, as for example, the circumstances that Jews mostly live as a minority. Okay, maybe they're a minority. They're a small group amongst a larger group, and that always can sort of invite a certain animosity or aggression. He goes on, he says, two other particular peculiarities that the Jews possess, however, are quite unpardonable. The first is that in many respects, they are different from their hosts. Right? This is, again, there's something about the Jews that makes them different, not fundamentally so, since they are not a foreign Asiatic race, as their enemies maintain, but mostly consist of the remnants of Mediterranean peoples and inherit their culture. Yet they are different, although sometimes it's hard to define in what respects, especially from the Nordic peoples. And racial intolerance finds strongest impressions, strange to say, in regard to small differences than the fundamental ones. Meaning, right, the Jews are different, but they're not that different from Germans, right? Part of the whole Nazi racial science, right, tries to argue how Jews are genetically different from Germans. But as we know how ridiculous that is, right? Jews look like Germans because they, aren't really that different, right? So that part of the reason for anti-Semitism is Jews are different, but almost indistinguishably different. And that's significant because we saw that in the Megillah, right? Haman's argument is the Jews are different, but maybe just different in a way that's hard to put your finger on. As I said, right, Mordechai and Esther are Persian names. They dress like Persians. They act like Persians. There'd be no way to know a Jew is not really a Persian. Now, how do we know this? Like, this is really significant. How do we know that there's no way to tell the difference between a Jew and a Persian? Because Esther hides her identity that she's a Jew, and nobody knows she's a Jew. Right? Nobody can look at Esther and say, look at that big Jewish nose. Ah, she must be a Jew. But she hides her identity. And because she does that, everybody thinks she's a Persian, which tells us that the difference between Jews and Persians is basically minimal to nothing, right? Which is exactly Freud's point. There's something about the Jews that makes them different, but it's very hard to put your finger on. And that's difficult for people. Small differences, what Freud calls the narcissism of small differences, are sometimes much harder than bigger ones. And then he says one more point, which really gets at the more deeper unconscious issues here that relate to the idea of the racial fantasy. Furthermore, among the customs through which the Jews marked off their aloof position, that of circumcision made a disagreeable, uncanny impression on others. Right? Jews are separate. Right? Jews are supposed to be, Am Levadan, right? They're people that dwells apart. Right? Jews are different. Jews mark their difference. We keep kosher, right, as a way of marking our difference. But the primary way in which Jews mark their difference is through the act of circumcision. And non-Jews struggle a little bit with the idea of circumcision, or at least in cultures where circumcision isn't common. And Freud uses this language of it makes an uncanny impression on them. Uncanny is a very important word for Freud. In this context, we'll say it means that the idea that Jews circumcise themselves makes non-Jews uncomfortable, right? It kind of freaks them out. And why is this? The explanation probably is that it reminds them of the dreaded castration idea and of things in their primeval past they would fain forget. Right? There's something about circumcision that evokes an idea of castration. Now you have to understand, in this sense, it's almost like a literal castration, but Freud means a much deeper idea behind castration. For Freud, castration, sort of literal, but really means a sense of having your power taken away from you. Right? Because that's what castration is. Right? If you lose your phallus, right, that means you lose your power. So when non-Jews see Jews, they think about Jews being circumcised, right? It's almost like a reminder of themselves losing their phallus, their penis, losing their power. Now, the reason that's interesting is, again, we've already seen examples of this, right? We saw before in the racist fantasy against Black people in America, right? It's the Black man's sexual superiority that makes the white man feel small, makes the white man feel castrated, right? And we also saw it with Haman, right? Castration is, again, a sense that, like, there's somebody else out there who's enjoying in ways that I cannot. They're more powerful than me. They're getting off and I can't get off, right? That's the idea behind it. And there's something about that makes people feel very, very uncomfortable, right? This sense of when we're reminded of our own powerlessness in a very, very deep and scary, scary way. And that's what Jews do for non-Jews, certainly in Germany, because we'll see an example, the primary example in just a moment, but certainly for Haman as well. Mordechai's existence essentially castrates Haman, right? Haman, I'm going to use this language because the Megillah invites it, Haman, but it's not true language. Haman can't be a man as long as Mordechai is around, right? That's very clear. And that in Haman's attempt to get rid of Mordechai and get rid of all the Jews is an attempt, you could say, for Haman to affirm his masculinity. And if that sounds again absurd to you, the whole Megillah opens with the fact that when Vashti defies Achashverosh, what are the advisors worried is going to happen? That because Vashti defied Achashverosh, women everywhere will defy their husbands. Or therefore we have to send letters out to make sure everybody knows men are superior. Women have to listen to everything their husbands say. Right? So the very beginning of the Megillah is the fear of castration. Right? Men are going to lose their power. Men are going to lose their phallus, like I was saying. Right? And that's exactly what Haman is fearful of as well. That Mordechai's existence is basically, castrating to him. Now, I want to conclude by tying this together with, the most classic example of modern anti-Semitism with Nazism, which Freud is directly responding to. I'm not going to bring citations of Mein Kampf, though I did spend time looking at it this week. It's an interesting book, I'll say that much. We're going to instead look at a speech by Hitler that he gave in Munich in April 12th, 1922. So this is, he's essentially the head of the Nazi party. This speech is him laying out the vision of the Nazi party. But 1922 is during the Weimar Republic. We're still a long way from any kind of real rise to power. But you see Hitler's racist fantasy being laid out in very great detail here. And you will see the exact similarities to everything we've been talking about up until now. That as long as the Jews are around, the Germans cannot enjoy fully. Right? The Jews are stealing Germany's enjoyment, and that if we can get rid of the Jews, right, Germany will be able to enjoy fully once again. So I'll just read a little bit of this. He opens by, again, much of Nazism's rise to power is fueled by the resentment Germans feel in the wake of World War I. Like Germany entered World War I with these great expectations. They're going to be a world empire. They're going to kind of like expand and have this profound cultural influence throughout the world. And they ended World War I defeated and in tremendous debt. So there was a sense here, again, as we saw before, like Germany's experience going into World War I was like Haman leaving the party or leaving the invitation to the party, right? We saw this, right? In the moment when he should feel the most proud and most triumphant, he sees Mordechai, he feels castrated, and he can't enjoy. And that's exactly the position that the Germany had after World War I. He says, after the war, production had begun again, and it was thought that better times were coming. Frederick the Great, after the 7-year war, had, as a result of superhuman efforts, left Prussia without a penny of debt, meaning things were really good at the beginning of the war. We thought this was going to be Germany's moment. We had no debt. At the end of the World War, Germany was burdened with her own debt of some 7 or 8 milliards of marks and beyond that was faced with the debts of the rest of the world, the so-called reparations. Germany was forced to pay reparations after World War I. They were in tremendous, tremendous debt. And if we ask who is responsible for our misfortune, right, and debt here, I'll just point out, is a fundamental loss of honor. Right? If you owe things to other people, that means other people have power over you. And remember, like we saw with Haman, it's all about power. When it's all about power, you got to have the power. If everybody has power over you, that's a problem. And as we said before, when Mordechai doesn't bow down to Haman, it's like he has power over Haman in that moment. And Haman cannot stand that. He will not tolerate that. And remember, it makes him so insanely angry. He says, and if we ask who's responsible for misfortune, it's not the military defeat, it's the misfortune of the debt. Then we must inquire, because again, money is enjoyment, like I said before, right? Enjoyment is like money, sex, and power. Money is a big part of it. And if we ask who's responsible for our misfortune, then we must inquire who profited by our collapse, right? Who are the ones that got the enjoyment from our collapse? And the answer to that question is the bank and stock exchanges are more flourishing than ever before, right? It's the banks. The international stock exchange capital would be unthinkable. It would never have come without its founder, the supranational, because intensely national Jews, right? Jews are the ones who run the banks, and therefore the Jews are the ones who have taken our profits, taken our money, stolen our enjoyment. But we can't enjoy as long as the Jews are here because they've taken our enjoyment away from us. And he goes on to describe it in his fantasy, his racist fantasy. This is very clearly Hitler's racist fantasy, the ways in which Jews enjoy and Germans cannot. Where we saw this before with the American fantasy, right? The black man enjoys sexually in a way the white man can't, right? Here it's the Jews enjoy financially in a way that Germany cannot. And his examples here are very, very clear in that sense. He says, the Jew is not growing poorer. He gradually gets bloated. And if you don't believe me, I would ask you to go to one of our health resorts. There you will find two sorts of visitors, right? If you want to believe, if you don't know, if you want to be sure whether a Jew is enjoying more than the German, go to a resort, right? Go into the Catskills, so to speak, right? And who are you going to see there? The German who goes there, perhaps for the first time for a long while, to breathe a little fresh air and to recover his health. Right? When you go to the resort, you might see some Germans there, but they don't get to take vacations very often. This is probably the first time a German is really getting to enjoy. But who else are you going to see there? You're going to see the Jews. And the Jew who goes there to lose his fat, meaning the Jew is going there because he's fat, right? The German goes to relax. The Jew goes because they're already so fat because they've been enjoying so much that they have an excess enjoyment, right? They have so much enjoyment. That's why they're going there, to get rid of some of it. The German goes there just to have a little bit of enjoyment. And he goes on to say, no, assuredly, the Jew has suffered no privations, right? The Jew, he gets everything. He gets all the enjoyment in the world. They don't lose anything. But the Germans, we're suffering, right? We're having such a hard time. He goes on here to describe this isn't true just for the Jews in Germany. This is true for the Jews, the communist Jews in the Soviet Union, right? Because again, in the Nazi mindset, the enemy is the communists, and Jews are associated with communists. And he gives this example of Jews in communist Russia. Again, it's his fantasy about how the communist Jews are living the greatest life imaginable. He says, well, now in Soviet Russia, the millions are ruined and dying, right? Again, after the revolution, right, the situation's not so great for a lot of Russians. Chechen, and with him a staff of over 200 Soviet Jews. Shecharna is like one of the people in charge. Travels, but he goes, he's Jew, I think he's Jewish, and he goes with his other Jews, travels by express train through Europe. He visits the cabarets, watches naked dancers perform for his pleasure, lives in the finest hotels, and does himself better than the millions whom once you thought you might fight as bourgeois. Meaning the whole idea of the communists is that they're supposed to fight the rich, right? Take down the rich, spread the money around, right? But what Hitler is arguing is that the Jews who are now in charge of communist Russia are traveling Europe and having the best time ever, right? They are enjoying, right? That's literally what it means to visit a cabaret, watch naked dancers. Again, money, sex, pleasure, right? That's enjoyment. They're having all the enjoyment. And you thought the whole idea was to get rid of the rich. No, he's saying it's about so that the Jews can enjoy excessively. The 400 Soviet commissars of Jewish nationality, they do not suffer. The thousands upon thousands of sub-commissars, they do not suffer, right? The Jews have got it great in Russia. No, all the treasures which the proletariat in his madness took from the bourgeoisie in order to fight so-called capitalism, they've gone into their hands. All that power and enjoyment that the rich had, right? It's been taken away from the rich, and now the Jews have it. But the workers don't have it. Once the worker appropriated the purse of the landed proprietor who gave him work, he took the rings, the diamonds, and rejoiced. He had now got the treasures which before only belonged to the bourgeoisie. But again, this is the Jews. The Jews got the treasures. The Jews got, remember we saw before, right, Haman? What does he want? He wants the king's crown, the king's clothes, the king's horse. He wants those treasures, the symbols of power and enjoyment, right? And instead, Mordechai got it. And the same is true here, right? Like the Jews have taken over Russia. They're in the position of power. They're like the king, right? So too, that's what we saw was Haman's fantasy turned into a nightmare with Mordechai. Mordechai gets everything that he wants. So again, to me, the dynamics are fascinating. How you see these profound connections playing out between the Megillah and modern day history. And again, with Germany, the striking thing about Nazi anti-Semitism is that German Jews were the most assimilated of any in Europe, which means Jews were not being singled out because they were so different, right? If anything, Nazi anti-Semitism was fueled by the fact that Jews were so similar to Germans. And that goes back to what I said before, this idea of the double, the sibling, right? It's because they are so like me that I look at them and say, they must be getting all those things I want. We're typically jealous mostly of people who are like closer to us, right? The people who are like living a life we can't even imagine, we're not jealous because we don't identify with them. But if you identify with the other, that's why you think they're enjoying in ways that you can't. And it's clear that Hitler identifies with the Jews. He has an obsession with the Jews, right? He sees Germans in the Jews, right? That's why it's so scary to him, right? There's actually a famous line that Hitler or one of his associates actually says, we have to get rid of the Jew inside of us, right? Because that's how deeply he identifies, with them. And again, it's a narcissism. It's about power. It's about this fantasy of total enjoyment that can never happen. Because if one thing Jews understand by virtue of the fact that we're all circumcised, is that we are lacking beings, right? To be a Jew, right? To be somebody who has faith in God and has survived these thousands of years comes with the realization that there is no fantasy of total enjoyment just awaiting us tomorrow if we can just get rid of our enemies, right? The world, one thing Jews know is that the world does not work that way. But the fantasy that it could or it should, and the belief that there's an enemy who's preventing it from happening is at the heart of anti-Semitism and at the heart of racism at large. I'll just conclude with one final point, and I happened to come across this over Shabbat as I was looking at some material on the Megillah. So as you all know, there's a famous statement in the Gemara that we're supposed to drink until one doesn't know the difference between Arur Haman Lebarach Mordechai, right? The difference between Haman is cursed and Mordechai is blessed, right? And there's so many different ways to interpret this. What does it mean to drink to the point that you don't know that Haman is cursed and Mordechai is blessed? But I found a fascinating answer from the Chochmat Manoach, which he says something that ties into what we've been looking at up until now. Which again, when it comes to Purim, it shouldn't just be, look at the anti-Semites, right? These dynamics are, in a sense, universal, right? We all can have a racist fantasy that's no different than Haman's. We all can have an irrational hatred of another that we identify with, but believe they are preventing our full enjoyment. And what Chochmat Manoach says is that the real meaning of drinking to the different, so you don't know the difference between blessed as Mordechai and cursed as Haman, is that we all have people in the world that are like Haman for us. There are people in the world that we hate because they've done bad things to us. But he says we also have people in the world that are like Mordechai for us. People that are like Mordechai because they've got it so good, right? Because they're so blessed. And what he points out is at the end of the Megillah, it says the very last verse, and Mordechai was appreciated by most of his brothers, right? That's what it says. And Ibn Ezra explains, well, what does it mean he was appreciated by most of his brothers? He just saved the Jewish people. Like, shouldn't everybody love Mordechai? But Ibn Ezra explains that it's not possible for a person to become beloved by all because of the jealousy that exists between brothers. And again, as a rabbi, I identify with this because, like, no matter what you do, there's always going to be somebody who's not happy with you. But Ibn Ezra's point, even Moshe, we know this, even Moshe Rabbeinu, right? Not every Jew loved Moshe Rabbeinu. But the reason that not everybody will be happy with you is because there's always this sense of jealousy that exists between brothers. Because there'll be somebody out there that says, if I could just get rid of Mordechai, life would be better for the Jews. If I could just get rid of Rabbi Truboff, the shul would be so much better. Right? That's just the reality of life. So what does this mean then for Purim? He says the eating and drinking that people do together on Purim, it's really about trying to bring Jews together. Right? It should bring the hearts of people closer together and love between them, as is well known, until all hatred and jealousy is removed from their hearts. When we drink until we can't know the difference between cursed is Haman and blessed is Mordechai, it means that we're supposed to put ourselves in a situation on Purim where we don't have any more Hamans in the world that we hate because they're bad, and we don't have any Mordechais in the world who we are jealous of because their existence prevents us from achieving everything that we want, that things would be better without them. And he says when we eat and drink with Jews on Purim, that's what we're ultimately trying to achieve. We're trying to remove the hatred in our hearts and remove the jealousy in our hearts. So in a sense, if we say Haman is Amalek, and that the goal on some level is to eliminate Amalek, if we're going to try to achieve that on Purim, right, we got to try to overcome our own inner demons, our own, individual and collective racist fantasies about those out there who, again, if we could just get rid of them, everything would finally be okay. But as I said before, if one thing Jews understand, that's simply not the way that the world works. And the people who don't recognize that, unfortunately, historically, often took the Jews as a target through which they could project and basically vent all of their anger and frustration about, again, the fundamental limitations of what it means to be human.